Welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Semi. Today I'm going to teach you how to do binding. I've covered binding in a couple other tutorials, but this one is just on binding. So you can bookmark this for the next time you have to finish up a quilt. So what I've done first is I have cut the amount of binding strips that I need to do this quilt. And I cut mine to 2.5 inches for this demonstration, but once you get confident in doing binding, you can definitely do it at 2.25 or even 2 inches once you become a pro at doing binding. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to unfold my strips and I'm going to lay them right sides together at an angle, and I want them to be at a right angle, and it is important that the strip that is facing the right side up be going out to your left, and then the other strip that is facing down be going toward you. And the reason why is because when we sew this, we're going to sew from point to point here, and then when we fold that open, it's going to make a straight strip. So you want to make sure you're marking from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. If you do it the other way around, then when you fold it back, you're not going to have a straight strip. So what you can do here is you can use a marking tool if you want, but you just want to, or you can even eyeball it once you get good at this. But what you want to do is mark a line from point to point. And I always leave a little bit hanging because that gives me a nice visual of where it is that I need to go. And then when you're starting out, it sometimes is helpful to put a pin or 2 or 3 or however many you want in to help keep those at a nice angle when you're sewing it. So once you have your line marked and you're ready to go, what you can do is you can just put that through your sewing machine. Now it's really important at this step, before you do any trimming, to make sure that it has been put together correctly. So what I like to do is just open this up and make sure that everything is flowing nice and evenly. If it's off a little bit, it really isn't a big deal, but if it's more than like 1/8 of an inch, you're going to want to rip your seam out and do it again, because you don't want this to be off, because the next step is going to be folding it in half. So once you're happy with the way that your seam is put together, you can go ahead and take your scissors and you can trim that down to 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it doesn't have to be perfect because we've already have our accuracy from sewing, but you don't want to get too skinny with this seam also. So now I'm going to go ahead and keep doing this for the rest of the strips that I have for my binding until they're all attached into one long strip. And then we're going to come back and do the next step. Alright, I've moved my sewing machine out of the way for a minute because now I need to press the big long binding strip that I've created. And there's multiple ways to do binding. This is the way that I do it. It's more about finding which way works best for you than which way is like the one correct way. Because if anyone tells you there's just one correct way to do something in quilting, run. There are many, and you just need to find the way that works best for you, and this is the one that works best for me. So what I do is I just fold over my corner and press that down so that it's a nice 45-degree angle there. And then I fold it so that it's hot dog style, so that the edges of the binding are meeting. And then you just want to press that in place, and we're going to go all the way down the width of your binding, and I'm not going to make you sit through that because that would be very boring. So go do that on your own binding strip, and then we're going to come back and we're going to get it sewn onto the quilt. So I finished pressing all my binding, and now I'm ready to put it onto my quilt. And I've done a few things here to make my life a little easier. First, I've installed a walking foot on my machine. Now this comes standard with most machines, but if you don't have one, usually you can get a universal one with either a high shank or a low shank that fits your machine for about $30–$35. So you just have to bring your machine in and see if it works. If you have a more specialized machine that is on the higher end of the price scale, then that might be much more expensive than that. But if you can get a universal foot, then they're not that expensive. The reason why it works great is because there are feed dogs on the top of the foot as well as on the bottom, and it helps moves all those layers of your quilt together at the same rate so that it doesn't bunch. And I also have machiner's quilting gloves. They come in multiple sizes, so they'll fit your hands. They've got these little grippies on the fingers that make it really easy to work with a quilt when you are putting binding on or doing machine quilting on your home machine. I use it whenever I bind, and I've tried gardener's gloves. I know that some people might do that as a hack, but it really doesn't work as well. And these are really lightweight, so they're great in the summertime or if you have problems with your own personal furnace. That was a big issue for me when I was pregnant. So, what you want to do here is put your fabric that we put the that fold in, and we want to line that up with the edge of our quilt top. And I always leave about 1 inch of batting on the side, and that gives something for that side of that feed dog to grab a hold of, and I find it helps me have better results with binding. So what I do to judge a 1/4 inch seam is I get my edge of my binding and the edge of my quilt top in line with the edge of the metal part of my feed dog or my walking foot. And you can measure that out on your own because every walking foot is going to be a little bit different, but that's a good way for me to tell. And then I've also set up my machine so that it's going to stitch 3 stitches forward and back and then go forward again. So that way this will be nice and secure when we go around the edge. So when I start sewing, I'm going to start in a couple of inches because I want to leave this flap free for when we get around to the other side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and sew forward 3 and then go back 3 stitches, and that helps secure everything. And then you can just go ahead and sew. Now when you approach the corner, you want to sew until you're about a 1/4 inch away from the edge. And if you need to mark that, go ahead and do that. And that's the edge of the quilt top. Now what I do is I leave my needle down and I turn my quilt. And that helps keep the thread from getting all crazy and stretched out. And then I go ahead and pull my needle up, and then I pull it toward me just a little bit. And then you want to pull your binding so that it is folding away from you, and you have this nice 45-degree angle here on your fabric binding. And then fold it so it's coming back down toward you. And what that does is it creates this nice little dog ear flap here. That should be loose. You don't want to tie that down. And now I'm just going to do a little bit more adjusting to make sure that that's at a nice right angle. And then I'm going to start sewing again at the tip of where my fabric and my binding are. And as you're sewing back, this should be nice and loose. You should be able to open that. You shouldn't have sewn it down because we're going to need it to be loose when we flip it over. So go ahead and keep going around, and we're going to stop when we get to the end, and I'm going to show you how to finish that up. Alright, so I've come to the end, and now it's time to secure down this flap that we left open at the beginning. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pin, and I'm going to put that in going parallel to the edge of the quilt because I don't want to sew over it. I want to keep that in there to keep this nice and snug as I sew over it. Now I'm going to take this part of the binding that I've been working with, and I'm going to lay it so that it is even still with the edge of the binding, but then I need to pull that up at a 45-degree angle, and I've got maybe about 1 inch or so between the bottom of this triangle that we left open and then the bottom of this triangle here. So I'm going to just hold that in place, and I'm going to sew all the way down. And now I'm sewing past where I first started stitching, and then I'm going to reinforce those stitches. And then I can cut that. And now I'm all right to remove this pin. because we don't need it there anymore. And now I can trim this binding as well. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm just going to snip it about maybe 1/2 inch or so below where the edge of that fold is. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut straight up. And now when we bind this by hand, that'll tuck right into this fold here as we finished off by hand. Alright, I put my sewing machine away because the rest of what we're going to do is all handwork. And what I did off camera is I cut off the rest of that batting so that everything is even with the edge of your quilt top and binding. If you've gotten this far, then you know how to use a rotary cutter and ruler and you don't need me. So when you're sewing binding by hand, you want to grab a width of thread that is about from your fingertip to your elbow. Any longer than that, and it's likely to get knotted as you work with it and be very frustrating. So I'm using brightly colored thread today so that you can see it a little bit better on camera, but normally I use just plain beige with this because when you sew the binding correctly, you don't need it, the stitch is invisible, so you don't really need to worry too much about your color thread. But if you're just starting out, it's probably a good idea to match the color of your thread to your binding. So what I've done is I've threaded my needle and now I'm going to sew a quilter's knot. And to do that, you pull the end of the thread so that it is going in the opposite direction of your needle. And then you want to pinch that together and circle it around the needle 3 times toward you. And then pull that down, that thread down, so that it's pinched between your thumb and your forefinger. Then go ahead and push that needle up through your finger, keeping hold of that twisted fabric, and pull the needle all the way through and you'll have a nice little knot at the end. And that's a great way to do a quilter's knot, and it is very secure when you are sewing your binding together. So now it's time to actually get started with the binding. So this is a great thing to do while you're watching TV. I always get a Netflix marathon going because this is not one of my favorite tasks to do, but obviously you have to do it or you won't have a finished quilt. So what I do is I start a couple of inches away from where that flap is that's hanging out, from where we're going to fold the fabric in. And I fold it over, and you want to make sure that you can pinch that batting in between your thumb and forefinger because you want the batting to fill all the way out to the edge of the binding, but you don't want to have it rolled over or have empty space. So what you want to do is insert your needle about 1 inch or so away from the edge of the binding once it's folded over, and then bring it out right on that fold. And that's what helps makes it nice and invisible. And then your thread will be hidden. Make sure that your needle's only in the batting, not going through the top for that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my needle in right where that thread came out on the binding, but I'm going to put it into the backing. And I'm going to let that needle travel about 1/4 inch through the backing, or through the batting fabric. You don't want it to pop through the front. And then I'm going to bring it out again right on that fold. And then go ahead and fold over and tuck your fabric in. And then you can kind of just keep going along the edge of this. And don't worry about tacking down where these fabrics go together. You'll do that at the very end. And I won't show that on video, but I will show how to tack down the corners, and it's pretty much the same thing. So just go ahead and keep on sewing until you get to your corner. And I'm going to show you how to do that mitered corner as well. Now when we sew the binding onto the front of the quilt, we sew it in a mitered border. So that requires a little bit special treatment as we sew it to the binding to the back of the quilt, not by hand. So the way I always do it is I sew all the way to the edge of the quilt with the binding laid out flat. So you're going to have the side you're working on will be folded down, and then the other side is just going to be kind of hanging off to the left there. Then once you get all the way down, you're going to kind of go back a little bit and put your needle in where you can see your seam line from where you sewed the binding on. And you're going to run the needle from there through the batting of the quilt to the front of the quilt where the binding comes together to form that 45-degree angle. And you want to have your needle come out right at that corner. Then you're going to want to go ahead and pull that needle out and tack down that little fold that is made there from that miter border. And then take your needle and put it straight through that fold, going straight to the back of the quilt. And then, once you have that all the way pulled through, then we can fold over the next side that we're going to work on. Again, to create a nice 45-degree angle on that fabric fold and a 90-degree angle on the corner. And then you want to tack it down on the back as well. This is going to take a couple of stitches, much more than the front. And I always take one extra stitch once I get down to the bottom, tacking that right in place of where that 45-degree angle ends. And then I just go ahead and keep sewing as normal down the rest of the binding. And if you've done this correctly, you'll have a perfect 90-degree angle on your corner, and it makes for really sharp looking quilts. That's all there is to binding. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. For more quilting tips and tricks, make sure you go to quiltaddictsanonymous.com and check out the tutorial section for lots of other tutorials on other things related to your quilting addiction. Thanks so much for following along. Happy quilting!